Let me record. We're sharing. Cool. I'm going to do, hold on a second. I'm going to just change sharing screens because I can't, once I share, I can't see anybody. Let me share here. And then this over here. This over here. All right. Video panel. Okay, let's click caption. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is take this particular demo. Again, this is our starter code. I'm going to get rid of that. Boom. Should have forked it. And what we're going to do is turn it into this, which once you see it, it's not like, oh my God, this is crazy. That's like the most amazing grid thing ever. It's not, but how we lay this out and how we use grid to achieve this pattern, right? You could do this with Flexbox. You could do this with just normal div elements. There's nothing like magical about this thing. But you'll see here that there's some grid content here. Lots of like grid, 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 right? And then elements have specific grid. There's different versions or implementations of grid that we can use. And so we're going to take one of these and kind of run with it, okay? Let me go here to the grid. So inside of the CSS, which is really where we're going to be working, right? The CSS is where we apply grid. And so I laid out the, like where we're going to be applying it. And so if I take a look at the HTML, just to see what we have here, right? If we're going to be doing this, we can see that we have headers, this page title, this main. I'm just collapsing those elements so we can kind of see them. Much smaller scope. There's content within them. We're going to be moving the main content around. So we have things like this masthead here is, where's our masthead? I think this is our masthead right here, right? First thing is the masthead, page title, which is this div with a class and page title. Then we have the main content here. We have an aside and we have a footer. And this is the structure. Right? And, you know, if you had to lay something out like this, you probably would have done the same structure. Put them on top of each other, let them stack. But we want to achieve a different view, right? We want something that is going to be more in line with this. This is what we're looking for here, right? Oh, what just happened? Okay. So we need to reposition some things around, especially, you know, masthead was up here, now it's here, right? So how do we flip those two positions? Sidebar is all the way over here. It was the full width, main content was the full width, now it's all the way over to the left. So we're gonna start with, I'm just gonna go back to the normal code here. And so where would we start to assign grid? Grid really starts with doing display grid. Now, display grid here doesn't really do anything like, what's the other display property that we had that did something the minute we turned it on? Like the other main one that we've worked with that allowed us to like, what's that? Say it one more time. I didn't hear it. Okay. Let's say I did this. If I do flex, that changes the design completely, right? So doing flex changes everything around, and using grid does not. So I want to make that kind of first distinction, that grid and Flexbox by default do different things. And grid's intention is to not do anything until you tell the thing where it's supposed to be. With Flexbox, Flexbox immediately says, oh, hey, you turned on Flexbox. Well, the default nature of Flexbox is to take all the content and make it sit next to each other and make them act like, what kind of elements do these things look like they act like? Are they like display block, display inline block?
Inline?
Inline, right? Inline elements sit next to each other, right? So it makes it appear to be inline. What if I wanted within the world of Flex for them to sit on top of each other, to go back to the way that they looked before? What would I change? Anybody know?
The float?
Float. Well, we would never use float necessarily here. Like if you're saying something like float left or right, that property is used sparingly now in design.
You said for them to sit on top of one another?
Yeah. Say I wanted them to act like this again with Flexbox.
Would it be absolute?
You're talking absolute as position. I like to try.
Block?
So I would have to add another property, and that would have to be flex direction column. Oh, what happened here? Did I not spell it right? Column, right? There we go. There's times when you want to do this, when you want them to kind of go back to this design where you flip back between row and column, okay? So with Flex, you have the ability to do this. There's also another way to do this where you would turn Flex on every item. Like what's masthead, if I put masthead here and I was like, hey, masthead, Flex 1, 0, 100%. Let me see, would it push them all down? Like, where is everything? Everything has now disappeared. I'd have to get them all back. What I'm trying to show, just kind of out of the gate, that Flexbox has a way of doing things, and it's a very more meticulous in regards to content, right? So it sees these pieces as content versus layout. And grid is layout. Grid is not necessarily content, but it's the broader scope of the elements themselves on the page and where they're positioned versus the content themselves. So I'm gonna go back to using grid. I just kind of wanted to do like a quick, hey, this is Flexbox. Let's see if some of those Flexbox properties kind of stuck. So just pull up my Flexbox here. All right, here we go. Here's our grid. Now, the first thing with grid is that there are columns and rows. So if you've been exposed to anything like Bootstrap, Bootstrap has columns and rows. And so when we turn on grid, one of the requirements for grid is to start to define what our columns and what our rows are going to be. So if I took a look at this solution here, right? What would we say are our columns? How many columns does it look like we have here? What does it look like? I'd probably say this is one column, right? And this is one column. Maybe it's easier to say how many rows does it look like, because rows are pretty obvious here. How many?
4.
4, right? So it looks like there's 4 rows. This one's a row. This looks like it's a row. This looks like it's a row. And then this looks like it's a row, right? So you can kind of see the main blocks of layouts there, right? Or the layout structure. So I can see that there's 2 columns, one column to the left here and one column to the right. And then I see a row, a row, a row, and another row. And that's what we're trying to reproduce. So how do I tell the grid that I want columns and rows? Now this is different than Flexbox, because Flexbox is like, the minute you turn on Flex, all the elements, no matter how many elements you give me, are going to sit next to each other. And then I have to kind of force them to like go down. I could use space between, to like push space between them. but it's not the same as this structured grid pattern, okay? So if I wanted a structured grid pattern, I'm gonna go back to my grid here, and I'm doing it on site. Now, site is the top level class, right? It's on body, and we know when we do flex, flex gets turned on the parent, and then turning it on the parent allows you to implement flex properties on all of the children, okay? So flex and grid work the same way in the fact that turning on grid here on site allows me to control the content in all of the sibling elements, but not their sibling elements, right? So if I went into main and I saw, oh, main has a code H2 and a paragraph, I can't apply grid to these elements. I can only apply grid to its parent element. And only so because main is a direct child of site, and site has display grid turned on. So this only affects the main children elements. So I'll just put a note here. Turning grid on affects only the container's children. Children, not their children's children, right? Children, okay? So I have grid. Now, I need to define those columns. And so in order to do that, I'll just put a note here. Define columns, or define grid columns, okay? Now the grid columns, we're gonna use a new keyword called grid. You're gonna see grid used quite a bit, like this grid word. Grid template columns, okay? Now when I do grid template columns, I have to give them some properties. I have to give them the values upon which I want those columns to take up. Okay, so if we did say that there were 2 columns, right? I could possibly say here, I don't know, 2 columns take up 50% and 50%. Now you see what just happened, right? Grid now is starting to take effect, kind of like the way Flexbox was before. So can anyone kind of just describe what just happened?
You told both of your columns to take up 50% of the page.
Sweet. And so what happened though? So the first column, this column of header, right? The masthead is in the first column, correct? It's in the first column. And then the page title is in the second column. And then what grid said was, all right, so I've cycled through the elements that that are your children, and I've decided that I'll take the first one and I'll put them in the first column, and I'll take the second one and I'll put them in the second column. And what I'm also going to kind of create here is a row. So this thing also has a row that we don't see, but that we didn't define, but you can clearly see that there's a row, right? I mean, they look like they're rows, because all this content's here, then this content's here, then the next main content, which is this one, line 22, has been moved left, right? Then this one is on the right, and then this one goes left. So what we see here is that it's defaulted to creating these types of columns, okay? Now, I wanna just try something real quick. I had installed a tool, and I wanna see if the tool is gonna work here. All right. So for us to kind of work with grid, there's a couple of tools that we could possibly use to see some of these grid patterns. And this tool right here, it's a plugin for Chrome. Let me just go to the Chrome extensions here. That particular is this Chrome Grid Highlighter tool. So the Chrome Grid Highlighter tool. Okay, Ultra Grid Inspector. Let me see, is this the same one? That's not the same one. I've tried using this Gridmon. It doesn't work as well. I'm gonna try adding it just real quick. Let me just do this real quick and see if it works as well as I thought, because last time I used it, I don't think it worked to the degree that I thought it was going to work. And so I kind of stopped using it. Yeah. Doesn't necessarily work. See, I can hover over something and I don't see anything. So that one's not the tool. This particular one here, even though you can barely see it, shows some lines. We can clearly see some lines. If I click it, the lines go away. If I click it again, I can see some lines. So that, once again, was, I'm going to go back to these extensions here, the grid. All right, Chrome highlighter. I want this particular one, design grid overlay Chrome. This should be it. Let me see. This one it? No. And so many tools. Grid inspector, ultra fast. Here, I think this is the one. Is this the one? No. All right. So you know what? We're not going to install it. I can't seem to find the extension for it. Unless it tells me here to go to the details of it. Maybe it'll go here. Here we go. Download it from here. Awesome. No, I think I had to download it in a different way. All right. Never mind the tool. If we do go into full screen mode here, I went into live view, we can also use developer tools to kind of inspect it as well. And we should see, get rid of this, also that if I highlight things, I can see those elements here. And I do see, even if I turn this off, Chrome does show these little boxes. See the little lines? You can barely see it, but is this little line here, and it's showing that it's broken down these elements into those different grid-like patterns. We can see that that's there. All right, I'm gonna go back. Here, we defined our columns. Now, the columns were defined, 2 columns, and yet it created some default rows for us, okay? These things only have a certain height and width, and so it gave them these columns and rows. I'm now going to tell Grid to do template rows. So now I can define the rows that I want to see. And so if we were to define rows, once again, we can use, we can use percentages of the height. We could say, I don't know, 20%, let's see, 20%, 60%, 20%. And so what it's doing here is it's taking the available free space that's on the page and now creating the rows based on that free space. And now I clearly have a row that is 20% of the height, another row that is 60% of the height, and then a third row that is 20% of the height. So you can see here that Grid gives you a lot more control now of the page and the layout, okay? So there is some defaults to it. Once again, if I got rid of row here, if I just commented it out, Grid tries to compensate. And Grid's like, all right, I'll put the things on the page the way that you want them. If I tell it the rows, then I have control over how much space those elements are going to use on the page, okay? You don't have to use percentages. You could use whatever you want. I could have said for the columns, instead of 50%, I could say 200 pixels. And it would give it only 200 pixels, okay? This thing is still trying to take up 50% of the available free space, okay? Because that's what I told it.
One question. In the page title and masthead,
Yep.
I see here that as you're moving some of those columns around, that as you see the demo sandbox for advanced layouts with CSS, it's being like covered or overlaid. Is that going to happen with our own content, or do we need to have that specified later?
So let me remove the row again and see what happens, right? So what do you think is happening now that I've removed the default, where I've told it I'm not going to assign an exact percentage for something or an exact value? Is the content viewable now? Yes.
Yes.
Right? We see it. Now, when I do it, I'm telling it I only want that row to be 20% of the page. And so it's going against kind of my content because my content is greater than 20% of the page, correct?
Correct.
Like this demo box, I would probably say has to be at least, I don't know, 30%, maybe 40%, right? If we wanted to see everything. So whatever you gave this content, if the content is greater than in height or width of the box that you decided, the percentage here, then it's going to get cut off. And we clearly see that the content now kind of gets cut off there. So the question might be like, all right, do I go back here and like give these things smaller font sizes? Do I give this less padding? We can clearly see between page titles and masthead, these black boxes, there looks like there's some space there, right? And so it might be like, I don't know, do I go here and like remove that margin there to decrease the size of it? Do I remove the margin on this H1 to increase or provide more space, right? Because that would be the question. There's another setting that you can do. So know that when we do these, we define the grid columns, and I'm going to say define grid columns and rows, right? Some of the values that we can use, I'll just put another note here. Values can be assigned are percentages, right? So when we did percentage worked at least with the columns, but not with the rows. We can assign fixed values, pixels, right? Pixel values. So once again, instead of 20%, I could say 30%, and I see the content. That 30% could have easily been like 300 pixels. I don't know, something like that. But there's this other new unit, and this is this kind of crazy new unit that gets introduced with CSS Grid. It's called an FR unit, okay? Now, besides like percentages and pixels, what are there, before I jump into FR, do you know of any other type of responsive assignments that we can give besides percentage and pixels? Has anyone heard of like M's and Rems? Has anyone heard of that?
Yes.
Okay, and what are they used for?
I think they refer to the font size.
Okay.
I know the M's, isn't it like micro spacing or just like dividing certain pieces or giving certain spaces like borders in between the content?
No, I think Chrissy was more online with it. It is, so it's more for Rems and M's act like a percentage. So they kind of act like this percentage, but they act like a percentage based on whatever their parent was assigned. So if their parent was assigned a percentage of, I don't know, say, and Chrissy, I'm going to follow the pixel, the font kind of example that you provided. If I have my parent, which is the site, right? So the site has some pixel sizes set to it. Let's just say I set the pixel, the font size here to be, I don't know, 16 pixels, right? Now you see how the pixels change, right? Everything changes. The pixel size change because I'm telling the site all of the pixel sizes should be 16 pixels. And that looks like what this did here, or something changed. Let me go back down and see if there's an M. Oh, here. So there are already M's. If I go into the page title, you'll see that this H1, right? This demo sandbox for advanced layout with CSS Grid is a particular size already, right? An H1 has a size. I don't ever really go out of my way to change the H1. Sometimes you do, but you don't always. So why did turning on font size here of 16 pixels change the font size of the H1? Considering that here it doesn't look like the H1 has any direct font sizes applied to it. And I don't think it's anywhere either. I'm just looking here to see if there's anywhere else where font size for the H1 is set. I don't really see it anywhere. So I would do this. In order to see where it came from, I would go here, click on the H1, and then take a look and see where font size was coming from. And what's the font size of an H1? What does it look like? It's 2 M's, right? 1 M is 16 pixels. So what's 2 M's? You know, the math is 32 pixels, right? 32 pixels, correct? So when I went in here and I changed this font size here, and I told the whole site to have 16 pixels, this particular H1 is like, oh, I'm supposed to be 2 M's of whatever this is. And so it changed its font size to be this. So the font size must have been different or set somewhere else different, because we see that it is changing. And it's changing because of the H2, or I'm sorry, the H1 has a specific font size, and it's looking towards its parent to make the decision upon what that font size should be. And it's going to be, at least for the H1, I mean, you can see all the other text too changed its size as well, right? If I get rid of this, you're going to see the rest of the content also kind of expanded or grew in font size. So M's are a percentage of the parent. If the parent has font size assigned to it, the child will look towards the parent and be a percentage of that value. Okay, so an M is like direct parent. A rem is a HTML. It looks towards the HTML for those settings. HTML, okay? An M looks towards the parent. A rem looks all the way up to the HTML itself right here to determine what its new size should be. Okay, it bypasses the parent. This is a direct parent. This does the same thing. M's and rems do the same thing in regards to a percentage, but rems look at the direct parent to evaluate what it should be, and rems look towards the HTML tag to decide what it should be. Okay, that's the difference between these. So I didn't want to go down the road of exactly or working through those examples, but I wanted to show you that there's other ways to assign percentages to things, or there's other values that we can use to assign using template columns and template rows, as well as anywhere else. Almost anywhere where you use percentage, you can use pixels. Anywhere where you use either the V's, you can use M's. And then you can use rems. And now we're on to this like new thing called a fractional unit. That's what this stands for, a fractional unit, okay? And so a fractional unit is like, what? I had these rems and I have these M's and I have percentages and pixels, and now they're giving me this brand new thing to work with. And so what is a fractional unit? So here's my question. If I was to turn flex back on, right? If I turn flex back on here, these elements are deciding to do what? Take up the free space based on what? What are they doing? Like if I grow this out, if I keep pulling it out and give more space, these elements are going to expand in space, right? So the default nature of these elements is to kind of do what? What do you think it is? Who's got an idea? Layout can be hard. Layout is definitely not easy. So would we say, how about this? Would we say that there is a certain width to the page, right? And somehow what Flex is doing is saying, I am going to take that free space, right? All that space, all that width, and I'm going to take these elements and I am going to fit them into that free space and give them enough free space so that they can show their content. And if the page grows, I'm going to give the rest of that free space and kind of divvy it up equally amongst them. Because that looks like what it's happening, right? I'm divvying up the space. They all kind of look like they increase and decrease in size as the page grows larger, right? And they do look like they decrease in size as I squeeze in the space. So they appear to be some sort of percentage, right? Each one of these looks like they've been assigned a percentage of the free space, and they're just adjusting themselves based on that percentage. If I go back here and I turn grid back on, here, something similar, right? But I've hard-coded these to be certain sizes now, so I have more control. I can be like, you're going to be this size. When we do this, the other value that we can use for grid template columns with this new fractional unit is I can say this. I have 2 columns, and I want to split that that space up equally. Now, we know that 50% did just that, right? 50% split them up equally, right? But I can replace 50% with this new fractional unit kind of concept where I can say 1 FR. Nothing changed, right? And if I replace 50% with 1 FR, nothing changes. Everything stays the same. Because a fractional unit looks at the available free space or the width of the width that's available and says, I will be 1 fractional unit of that space. So they're kind of divvying up the free space and saying, I will be 50% and I will be another 50% of it. Which only goes to say, if I turn this into 1 fractional unit and I change it to 2 fractional units, well, now I'm taking up kind of 2/3 of the space, right? If I change it to 3 fractional units, I'm going to take up even more space. Okay? So this, you might think like, well, why did 50% work? Why the hell am I changing it to this fractional unit thing, right? Well, percentage kind of means like you have to know and assign all those percentages correctly. 20%, 80%, 20%. With the fractional unit, it's just a little bit more, there's a little bit more freedom involved. I have the ability to kind of adjust these by changing these fractional units and do like 1.3%, right? So maybe they're easier to understand, maybe they're not easier to understand, but with grid, what you are going to see is these fractional units be referenced everywhere. You're going to see a combination of fractional units and percentages and pixels. It's this new way of doing layouts, and I can't really tell you what the standard is yet because I've seen it done so many different ways. That I think it's still trying to like establish itself as the standard. Sweet. That means that if we can do template columns using these, then we can do the rows as well. Now, Rod, you had a a point where you were like, well, if I gave this only 20%, then I lost some of my content here. Like I can't see all of the content that was inside the page style. It's gone. And so does that mean I have to go back to my content and maybe force it to be bigger or smaller or maybe give it a direct size? Because, if I went in here and I targeted this one box, I targeted title and I'm like, here's page title. What if I give it a height? I'm going to try to force it to be, 300 pixels. See, I can force it down now. I can say 500 pixels, but forcing it down forces this one also down, right? So maybe we don't want to do this. Maybe I don't want to hard code it. Maybe I want the content to drive its height, which is what it was doing before. The content drove the height of these elements, right? So if I comment this out, the content drives their height. Their width is just going to be decided on the fact that this one's taking 50% and this one's taking 50%, but their height was divided by their content. What we can use is another kind of keyword here that we can use, and I'm going to append it to the end of this, called, oh, what did I do? Called auto. Now, the other value that I can set here is, watch, if I get rid of the 20% for that first row and I assign auto, what it says is, hey, you know what? The content in there is of this height. Like, there's this much content. So in order to really show the content, I need to be or make this box this height. And because of that, I'm going to do so because you set it to be auto. So auto is dependent on looking at the element itself and saying, hey, what is the element with either the largest content or has the greatest height, hard-coded, or based on its content, I will make that thing be the size that it needs to be to fit this model, okay? That's what we're saying here with auto. Now, we can still go ahead and apply. See how we have 60% here for these and 20% for the for the last one. For the rows, I think, you know, based on our design here, I would say, based on our design here, what does it look like? It looks like this might be auto, this one might be auto, and then this has some sort of height to it as well, right? So I'm going to go back here, and let's say, hey, auto, maybe the middle row has 2FR. Awesome. And then the last one, instead of being 20%, I can even say here, you're auto as well. And now auto takes over its full height. I'm forcing this thing to stay within the height of this box. So this container box has been assigned a specific height, so we can force it to stay within that realm, right? If I get rid of this and I say 20%, let me say 20%, then it's only 20%, okay? But if I say auto, what happens is, so what did we just see happened? The elements that have auto force themselves to be their height. So when this gets processed, it's like, hey, these elements that have auto are going to be their normal height. That's the first thing. So let me go through, let me grab the elements, whatever auto, they're going to have their height. And then whatever left, I'm going to start breaking down into this fractional unit. Okay? And so it kind of looks like it's a 1FR now, right? This almost looks like it's a 1FR. What if I change this to 1FR? Would I change it? No. It doesn't really change anything. It doesn't really have any space to go because these two of auto are being forced to be their height. I can't really force this thing to be any different than that. Okay? That makes sense? Grid's a little tricky. You know, I have to admit, like, grid does change things up a little bit. And because of that, it looks like this new way of managing the layout. Okay. I mean, we still have quite a bit more to kind of get through to achieve our layout. So how about, it's 11 o'clock, how about we take a 10-minute break? Let's come back at 11:10, and then we'll finish with our layout here. Okay. So break time. Back at 11 a.m. Sweet. Snap my share.
Joe, can we pause the recording?
Yeah, we'll do, Mace.
All right, thank you.
Zooming recording. All right. So our goal, our original goal, is to build out this design though, right? And for this particular design, we do have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. I'm sorry, 4 rows, 2 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. And so because we have 4 rows, what we can do here, another way to kind of do these rows, we have 4. And so we're going to have 1, 2, let me try 1 FR and 1 FR, okay, and then auto. 4 rows, let me see what I got here. 4 rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Auto, repeat. All right. Just to show you something else, I'm going to get rid of here and I'm going to put 1 FR. All right. So what I've done here is I've done another 1 FR, and we can see like how the rows themselves now have expanded. I have this extra space here. I went from 1 row to another row to another row, and then I have this extra row down here. It's like, well, what is that row for? Well, in the end, that's what we need, right? If I go back to the design, we need 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. But what we don't have in this design versus this design is that this element here, this page title, is taking up the full width. The footer is taking up the full width. So naturally, when something takes up the full width, it's going to push the other things down. And by pushing the other elements down, we're going to be able to leverage this last row here, okay? So another thing, not just one thing, but another thing in regards to doing grid is I'm going to add here, just to create some space between the elements, I'm going to add something called a grid gap. The grid gap, I'm just going to give 10 pixels. What the grid gap does is it creates a gap between the elements, right? So now I can create space between these elements just by using a gap. We could possibly have used like margin bottom, margin right to create some of that space, but a grid gap allows us to create a gap between them. So I'm going to just leave that. We're not really going to do much with the grid gap. I'm just doing that so we can see that we can create space between these elements. All right. Now we're going to move on to actually positioning these elements where we want. Up to now, grid has kind of been doing it for us, right? It's like, all right, well, there's 2 columns. And for the rows, well, this one says to be auto. It's not really working as we want it to work. And then here's the 1 FR, auto, 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. So it's really taking in the content and being like, all right, for the first row, I'm going to make you as big as your content. Your 1 FR, your 1 FR, and your 1 FR. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing. But the page title, let's go up here again. The page title is the first thing in the list, right? In the layout, not the list, it's in the layout. So what we're going to do is tell the page title to be exactly where we want to do it. This is kind of where some of the magic of grid really comes into play. So I think, Rod, you had mentioned when I was just discussing like properties with Flex before, I think you mentioned absolute, right? Absolute is used in the context of what? Can anyone tell me what absolute is used as a value in? Anyone tell me?
Float?
No, float would have been left, right. So when you use floats, you use float left or float right? What's the other one? Somebody's got to know this one. How about this? I'm gonna show you so I can force this thing to be where I want, and then we'll use CSS Grid to kind of put it in context too. What if I said for the page title, position absolute? It didn't do anything. Oh, it did do something. What did it do? Can anyone tell me what that did? How did turning position on app? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chrissy.
It takes it out of the document flow.
Correct. It takes it out of the document flow, and it kind of makes it act like an inline element where it's only the length of its content, right? And position absolute has been the way that we have taken elements and forced them to be wherever we want it on the page. That's really what position absolute has been done. And if I said bottom 0, it would put it onto the bottom of the page. If I was like right 0, it would put it onto the right side of the page. If I was like left 0, it would then make it the width of the page. So position absolute has been the thing that we've been using up to this time, and we will continue to use position absolute. There's solid use cases for using position absolute to force an element to be where we want this element to be. We're not going to be using that, but I'm bringing up position absolute because that's the one thing that you've kind of had in your toolkit to like force something to be where we wanted it to be. Grid now opens the door for us to do it in a different way. So I'm going to remove position absolute, okay, on the page title. Because even if I put position absolute on the page title, I put it up top, the other elements still don't see it. It's like it's there, but the other elements are like, I don't know that it's there, so I'm going to go to the natural position I would go if there was nothing above me, right? So taking it out of the document flow changes the way the other elements perceive the things around them, okay? And there's a way that we can force the parent to see it and force the elements, but we're not gonna do that. What we want to do is this. When it comes to grid, we know that we have rows and we have columns. Now with these rows and columns, there's a distinguishing thing about these rows and columns. Now, I'm going to Slack out the CSS Grid documentation, okay? This is the official guide to CSS Grid. And I'm going to take you just to a small section of it. Now, we've just touched on the surface, right? Turning on grid, right? We've done template columns and template rows, and there's specific values that we can use. I kind of covered some of those things like pixels and, you know, auto and percentage. Like we can use a combination. But what also happens is that the grid itself gives line numbers to these rows and columns. And so for this row here, the first starting line is line 1. That row ends at line 2. And the next row begins at line 2 and then ends at line 3. And the next one begins at 3, ends at 4. And you can see the sequence here. So there's positive numbers going this way, and then it reverses it with negative numbers. Flex also had something like that. We could do order and order things using their numbers, right? Everything has an order, even in Flex. Even the rows themselves, I'm sorry, these are the rows, these are the columns, these are the rows. They also have them 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, right? So what we can do back in our design is use this concept where these columns and rows have distinguishing numbers that tell them where they are on the page, and we can use that to put our content in those particular rows and columns. So I'm going to go back. Let's take a look. So page title, if I go back up here, if I go back to our design, what row would page title need to be in? The first row. What two numbers would that encase? 1 and 2, right? What column does it need to be in? So if I said row, that's great. What column does the row need to be in? Anyone tell me?
It needs to be in all four.
Correct. It needs to be in all four. So I'm going to go back to the design here. So for the page title, I'm going to tell it that its grid column is going to start at line 1 and it's going to go to line 4. Okay? We're not done, but you can clearly see now that it's taking up the full width. It's stretching itself across all of the columns. But that's not the position that we want it to be in, right? We want it to be at the very top. So if I have to give it a grid row, what would those values be? What would the grid row be here? Just think, if I went from column 1 to column 4, I want to do row 1 to row what? 2, right? That line. If we take a look at here, line 1 to line 2. Just like we did 1 to 4, I mean, this particular design has 2 additional columns. I'm going to go back here and say row 1/2. And now I get it exactly where I want it to be. So when we do grid column and row, we're basically telling, just want to put a note here. Grid, column, and row. What we're basically telling it is what is the starting line, starting, ending line numbers. That's what we're saying. Start at line 1 and go to line 4. Start at row 1 and go to row 2. Now, because we can also use, in this guide too, you see how it has negative numbers too? I could have said go to row column 1 and go to negative column 1, and it should have worked the same way. Let me see, column 4, if I do -1, does it work? Does the same thing. Actually, it changed some of the content up here. That's interesting. I didn't think it would do that. Let me see. Nope. But actually does something a little bit different than what I thought it would do. Pulls it up. Not really sure why it does that. Okay. And because we have 2 columns, 1 column, 1, 2, 3. Oh, that's why. We're not going to 4. We're going to 3. Because how many columns do we have? We have 1, 2, 3 columns, right? That's what we're shooting for. I'm sorry, 1 column and a second column, which means this line here is line 1. This line here is line 2. And this line here is line 3. So what I was actually doing was creating another column. So grid allows you to be like, oh, I know you defined some stuff up here, and you really only wanted 2 columns. But if you say 4 here, you're creating more columns now. Now there's actually 3 columns on the page. So grid is dynamic. You can adjust it later on. It takes a little while to get used to grid because it has this ability to like make changes later on, even though you're kind of dictating what the thing should be when it's originally created. At any point in time, it can be like, well, I really want to change it, and I want it to be this instead of that. And you can easily do that. Grid kind of adjusts. It's this flexible layout. So now that we have our title, right, we want our main content. I'm going to go here. And our main content is what? Where does our main content need to be? If I was to say for the row and column, so how about this? Just so I can see how everyone's feeling. Okay. when I say type in what you think the row, column, and row values should be for main content. Okay, so I'm going to give you a second. You can even play around with it. Don't slack it out now. I'm going to give you about a minute, maybe 2 minutes. I am going to, when I do say it, I want you to slack out or reply to this thread. So start a thread. Reply here. And I want you to put what you think the column and row values would be for main content in order to make it look like that. If you want, play around with it. All right, I'm gonna do this. 1 minute, boom. You can play around, you can try your own settings. Okay. I'm gonna slack what I'm working on because the original one that I slacked out, I had forked. So if you weren't following, if you made some changes, I'm slacking out my original one. Okay. But when this timer goes off, I'm gonna ask that everyone reply with what they think the row and columns values should be. Okay, timer's up. Not seeing any replies. Let me stop sharing real quick. What happened? Did I lose everybody? All right. Thank you, Quincy. Thank you. I need somebody. Give me something. Come on, Yashira, Rod. Come on. Sweet. All right. Grid column 1 to 3. All right. Looks like both Quincy and Yashira have it. The same thing. It said then we see grid row changed. So a day has grid column 1 to 2. And then grid row 2 to 3. Chrissy's grid column 1 to 2. All right. Let's see. Mace, how you feeling?
I'm still trying to figure it out.
Okay. All right. Let's see. I'm going to see if we can work through the solution. Okay. All right. So let's go here and take a look. See if we can't do this. So main content, right? Main content, we want to be, according to this design, if we have 2 columns, this one huge column over here and then this huge column over here, it would be column 1 to column 2. That would be correct. So I'll go back here and say, all right, so grid column 1 to column 2. Okay, so now it's in column 1 to 2, right? But now we have to tell it how many rows that it should be taking up and what row line from and what row line to. And you see, just another example here, you see how grid will even allow you to create empty spaces? if you tell things to be in certain positions, it doesn't necessarily fill the gap with anything. So you can create unique pages where there is no content in those spots, if that's the effect that you want. So back to the design. We know that we did column 1 to column 2. Now I'm going to put this in a row. This is the row line number 2, right? If I go back to this picture here, this is row line 2. So we probably start at row line 2 and go to row line 3, right? If every row starts with a number, and this row would be 1, this their line would be 2, then if I go back here and I did grid row, I would say grid row start at line 2 and go to line 3, right? But we have, for the grid rows, we have 4 rows, so I have to go, I think we got to go to 4, right? Yeah, we got to go to 4. Because in this design, it's line 1, line 2, and I forgot this. Forgot about this row. 3 and 4. Each row has a top number and a bottom number, right? And if you just work your way from the very top, it's always going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, and so 5. So if you have 4 rows, then the last number is going to be 5. First number is 1 for the line, the last number is 5. It's always going to be one more number than the actual rows or columns that you have. So now if we go back here, I can see that I got the content in there. All right? So it did look like, I'm going to say the majority kind of had it right, I guess, at column, well, 1 to 2. Grid column 1 to 3, right? Yeah, 1 to 3. Quincy, you got it. You sure you had gotten it? And then the row, I think, Quincy, you had gotten the row. Quincy had figured this out. And
I have a question, just real quick.
Sure.
On like the page title, the 1 to 2,
Sure.
what would be the benefit of doing the 1 to 2 instead of just saying like row 1, for example?
Oh, so you're saying if I just do row 1, that
Yeah.
works? You could do that, but what we want to do is kind of tell it where it should go to. What's its destination? Because I could say row 1 and go to, I don't know, row 4 if I wanted, and that messes things up, right? So think about this, like if somebody else is looking at the code saying go from row 1 to row 2 is clear and distinct, right? Doesn't leave any room for guessing. But once again, you could have just done it like this, right? And it seems to work. It's like, just go 1 row, maybe even here. Let me see. Can I just say this, row 1 column? And it seems to work. But that's not how you're going to see it written.
Okay, so is it mostly like just consistency then at that point, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
At that point in time, it's just, I'm even like, we're going to abbreviate this writing even to make it more terse. There's another way to write grid that even makes it seem more intuitive than it does now.
Okay.
But yeah, writing it like this is how you would have written it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, because we're even like shorthanding it. Do you see here on the right-hand side? You see how it's like this left pane is for the parent elements and this right pane is for the children. When you set the children, there's even a way of saying grid column start and grid column end, right? We're abbreviating this grid column start and grid column end by using those shorthands of just grid column and grid row. I never teach this because this just seems like such a longer way to do it, right? Too much typing when I can just say grid column and give it a start value and an end value, okay? That's what it's doing here, start and start end, but we can abbreviate that as just grid column and give it those numbers. I'm just looking to see, yeah, grid column and grid row, okay? And so this is the syntax that you're going to see done predominantly. Now, I'm going to preface that by saying too, like, grid is kind of new. We don't always teach grid. There's times when we do teach it, like as an advanced lesson, maybe unit 2, maybe unit 3, depending on where it fits in. Because you get thrown a lot of stuff, and it's just like, if you can't apply flex fairly well, flex is the more predominant front end layout that's being used, and grid is this new thing. But when it comes to grid, you can really get lost in the semantics of grid. There's a lot of different ways of doing grid that students just start to look at grid as a way to lay out everything, because you have this freedom to force things wherever you want. And they start to target the individual pieces of content like this, and start using grid there. And that's not a best practices for implementation of grid. Grid is for the much larger layout of your it's used for the layout of the page, and then for individual pieces of content within those boxes, you would use you would use Flexbox and other techniques, padding and margins and things to move things around. Cool. So, see what we got. I'm going to go back to the design, and I see here that we have our main content. We have masthead is over here now, and that is in the second row, and sidebar is in the second row. So let's kind of go back and see where we're at. Looks pretty good, right? CSS Grid and CSS Sidebar are where they need to be. So we don't necessarily need to define the masthead here or the sidebar here, because they kind of look like they are where they should be, right? But it's the footer content. The footer needs to be positioned someplace. How do we position the footer? What do you think we need to do with the footer here? Now remember, the footer and the page title are going to almost kind of be identical in how much horizontal space they take. So if I just look up at page title, I would be like, oh, the horizontal space was grid column 1 to 3, right? And that would be grid column 1, 2, 3. So it makes sense to be just, hey, grid column 1 to 3. And then we have it. I don't necessarily need to force it to be in a specific row at this point in time, because grid is like, all the other things have been kind of put in their place, and I need to like push things down. And so I'm going to push the footer down. And so it naturally fits in the last row. So you really don't have to tell me what row it should be in. You just have to tell me how many columns it needs to take up. Okay? That is one implementation of grid. One single implementation of grid. And there's other ways to implement grid. Here, I'm just going to do another poll. Of it. All right, here's my poll. How are you feeling about grid so far? Okay, we got one like it. Love it. Okay, love it and likes it. That's good. It's better than not sure how to use it yet. I think you can see from grid that it has structure, right? So for those that love it, what do you love about it? What characteristic of grid makes it so appealing at this point?
Easier to manage when the page closes and expands, content stays within its boundaries, which to me is like insanely important. So
Okay. So you're talking something like this, responsive design?
yeah,
Okay.
most definitely.
Okay, that's cool. What
I
else?
like how easy it is to control things. It seems like it's
Yes.
much easier to put things where you want to put them.
Yes. That has to be like one of the biggest selling points for Grid is that now, and this is where maybe the disconnect happens, is this particular content right here, right? The HTML was written just like this, and then we decided to move it around at will. What happens is people just start saying, well, you know, I could just put my footer at the very top and then move it to the bottom later, right? I mean, I could put anything anywhere in my HTML and then move it anywhere else later on. Don't let the fact that you can put things anywhere detract from, you have to write your HTML in the way that you feel it should be represented on the page. And then use something like Grid to move things around. Like, in all honesty, I mean, this is a demo to show you how to do it. But in all honesty, if I wanted layout to be at the very top and page title at the top, then I would have written it where this page title was above header, right? I mean, if that's what I wanted the visual representation of my data to look like, then I would have written it in the HTML to do just that. I wouldn't have put it in the second line and then moved it up. Like, why? Why would you do that? You know what I'm saying? So, but that being said, when it comes to responsive design and the need to move things around at will and make them kind of appear, disappear, go into different positions, then Grid really, really comes in handy to do something like that. Okay? Oh, hold on one second. Okay. So just when you do write your HTML, write it in such a way that it makes sense. And I'm trying to pull up another design that I can show you where things just kind of move around. Yeah. I mean, here's a really kind of responsive one that, you know, if I was to do responsive on this and say, let me zoom out here. Here's this, I can move these whole articles over to the right-hand side easily like that, right? So on desktop, boom, they're on the bottom, footer's there, and then on mobile, I can move them over to the right. So that could be a solid use case for using CSS Grid also, right? I'll just move it from here, tell it to be in a new column, boom, everything works. This actual design is actually done in Flexbox. Flexbox was used to do this. I'm just showing you that Grid could also have been used to make these design choices. I wouldn't necessarily make those design choices with this, right? This is just a demo to show you that things could be forced into different positions, okay? So that's one way to write CSS Grid. This way that we wrote it is one implementation of Grid, okay? But there's another way to write Grid that I think is even more kind of intuitive. And I kind of like this secondary approach, okay? So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to call this non-area, because we're not using non-areas. I'm going to save this. I'm going to fork it. I'm going to call this areas, okay? I'm going to select this one out. So if you wanted to follow, you can follow this one. I'm going to do a conversion. So at least you'll have a previous one and this one. You'll have two different implementations to kind of take a look at. All right? So I'm going to convert this into something that uses Grid template areas. And this is how I would write it. I'm showing you this way also, the first way, because once again, you're going to see it out there. It's everywhere, and grid is written in like these different patterns. I can't tell you when you look at something what you're going to see or what the design approach was for the person. All I can say is if you see it like this, you understand what's happening, right? So what I'm going to do now is we're going to add grid template areas, okay? And grid template areas allow us to use a naming convention for those particular areas. So instead of like grid column 1 to 3 and row 1 to 2, I could actually give it a name. That space, that visual space can actually be assigned a name, and we can assign it a name by creating a pattern. And so here's the pattern. This is where it gets really cool. I'm going to add a property called grid template areas. Okay. I'm going to go to the next line. Now, when we do grid template areas, I'm going to give each one of the columns, the rows and columns, a naming convention, okay? So here's my naming convention. For the first row, I want the first column to be called title. I want the second column to be called title. The third column in the first row to be called title, and as you can imagine, the last column to be called title. All right. Now, I'm going to go to the next line here, and I'm going to create another row, and for that row, I want the first column to be called main, okay, right? And for this one, we have 2 columns, right? 1 column, 2 columns. So I need to, oh, I think I went too many. I think I went too many here, right? Yeah, because we have rows. Oh, these are our columns. We only have 2 columns, and we have 4 rows. All right, I was wrong. So this is our main, and I'm going to call this our masthead. Okay? So this column here will be title. This column will be title. In this row, this column here will be main, and this column and this row will be masthead. Same thing. This column in this row, in the third row, is going to be called main. And let me do this. There's only one set of quotes around the whole thing. And this one will be called sidebar. Okay? So these represent the rows, and these divisions represent the columns. Now I go to the bottom. The bottom is the same as kind of title, except now I call it footer. I'm just going to move this up here, close it. All right. Nothing's really changed at this point in time. But what you can see is this grid template area is a visual representation now of how the page is kind of laid out, right? I can easily look at this and be like, all right, first row, title spans both columns. In the second row, main takes up the first column and masthead the second. In the third row, main takes up the first column and sidebar the second. And in the last row, footer spans both columns. Okay? Now we have a visual representation, and what's also important here, we have a naming convention for these sections. So before, when we had title here, right, I'm going to get rid of the title. I'm going to get rid of grid column row and grid column. I'm going to get rid of that. Now you see our design's kind of off, right, because title's like, I don't really know where to be yet. You don't really tell me where to be. So we're going to do this. Grid area title. And look at that. Now it looks up to the grid template areas and says, oh yeah, hey, where is title? Where should title B, and title is now defined as the first row spanning 2 columns, right? I can do the same thing for main now. In main, I could say grid area and just say main. And that's it. Like, I don't necessarily have to go to masthead and sidebar to define them because they are where they need to be. But, you know, just for safekeeping, I can go, hey, masthead, grid, area, you know, masthead. Okay, it'll put it there. And then I'll just copy this to sidebar, and I'll just put sidebar here. Here's another thing, too. Look what just happened. I copied masthead and put it onto sidebar. And what do you think happened here? Anyone tell me what looks like happened?
Overlay.
What's that?
Overlay and went over
Yeah.
into the masthead.
It's right up, its sidebar is sitting on top of masthead. So what you can also do with grid is create this effect where there's layers of things. And if I want, I can remove sidebar and then masthead would be right behind it, right? At any point in time, I could say sidebar, you know, display none, and look, grid appears. So I could literally have things sitting on top of each other and remove layers of things as I want to. Like if you click on a button, I could be like display none on that thing, and the thing goes and you see the thing behind it. Click on the button again, I grab the next thing, display none, you see the thing behind it. Okay? So we could do that. Now I'm gonna not do that. I'm just gonna go here and say sidebar. Oh, what happened? Oh, I put a D over there by accident. This makes it even easier to write grid. What you're gonna see is both ways. You're gonna see lots of different ways to do this. But when it comes to, I would say my preferred approach, I prefer to do it like this. Write the areas, visually see them defined, and then give them those definitions here. You still have to define this though. Like you have to do grid template columns and grid template rows. You have to define those. So that's important. If you don't define those, none of this is gonna work. There's one more shorthand keyword that I want to introduce you to, okay? And this just pertains to when you're writing the template columns or template rows. Do we see a repeating pattern in template rows? What's the repeating pattern that you see there? Anybody?
One fractional unit.
Yeah, it's referenced 3 times, correct? We can replace writing it 3 times with doing this. Repeat with this repeat keyword. Repeat 3 times 1 fractional unit. It's just a way of abbreviating some of those patterns. Now, once again, what we did, we created something really, really, really super basic. In a much more complicated design where maybe there's 12 columns and 12 rows, this pattern of using the repeat keyword may come in super handy at that time, okay? Using this allows you to repeat this pattern a certain number of times, okay? It's pretty cool. CSS Grid is awesome. I highly suggest that you try to implement it in your project, but do not try to replace using Flexbox completely. This should be a combination of both Flexbox and Grid. Like the two should go together. It shouldn't just be like, I'm gonna do one or the other, okay? I'm just looking for an article that I've assigned when I've taught Grid. Best way of just to show you, like, it is suggested or clearly defines the pattern between what you should be using and where. Let me see if I can find it here. CSS Grid versus Flexbox. All right. So here's an article that I signed. When I'm teaching, I usually do this when I'm teaching the Feud class. I'm going to Slack it out too. And here they discuss the differences between Grid and Flexbox, and they'll kind of walk you through some sort of layout. I'm looking for where they might have been very specific about where to use Grid. Where is this? Yeah. The truth is there isn't a better system. Both Flexbox and CS Grid are good at different things and should be used together. Okay? Don't try to like eliminate Grid altogether. Okay? You don't want to eliminate, I'm sorry, you don't want to eliminate Flexbox altogether. I think I had a better article. Let me see, can I find it? No. Yeah, it's like I got so many articles. I lose track of some of the articles, but cool. So how about giving Grid a shot? I bet you all want to give Grid a shot on your own, or not. You just find what I was gonna Slack out of the little lab here. Is it here? Here. Here we go. All right, I'm gonna Slack this out. Okay. So this is, oh, you know what, before I Slack that out, I'm just forking this to get rid of this do not edit. That's for my sake. Okay. All right, boom. So for this particular lab, I have this also configured like it's a much larger lab to like implement Flexbox, implement Grid, do responsive media queries here. You'll see how the screen changes. You see how there's media queries here. Also, they dictate what the size of the screen is. What I want you to do is, you see where it says link to all layouts? If you click on link to all layouts, it takes you to these different layouts, okay? Let me see if I zoom out. So here's a 2-column layout. We did a 2-column layout with 3 rows. This is a 2-column layout. This is a 3-column layout. You know, this is a simple marketing layout, okay? A marketing with nav. So they get more complex as you work through each design, right? And so the idea here is, in the HTML, you don't really have anything. I've broken it down here so that this is the 2-column layout. And there's a container. This box here is the container. How would you write out this particular layout? Like, what would be your design? Now, that being said, I want to point out also that we have specific CSS assigned to these particular naming conventions here. You have the use of a header, a footer, that makes kind of sense, right? A main, a side, an article, and a section. Okay, they were all given specific heights and widths to give you some initial starting point, and they're given some colors, so you can actually see what they are. So let's just say I wanted to implement this. What does this look like, the top and the bottom? What are those two clearly? What are those elements clearly?
Header and footer.
Header and footer. What's this middle content? How would you write that middle content?
Main content sidebar.
Okay, so put one thing here and then one thing here, right? That seems practical, correct? So if I was to do that, right, let's just say, I don't know, header, right? I can use Emmett here, header. Okay, look, I get the header. I can even just say here header so we can see header. Awesome. I can say footer, just so I can get those main pieces in place. Footer, cool. Have two things. And I put borders around everything so you can clearly see where things are and what their dimensions are. Now, the next one was that this should be, how should I write this? I think, Rod, you had mentioned it, right? How should I write it?
Sorry, I was on mute. I would put main content.
Okay, I'm going to divide this up so we can see that here and this here, right? All right. So you want to make this section all main and this an aside, right? Does everyone agree with that?
Yeah, I like it.
You like it? Okay. So you're saying make this main, right? And then you have something here called an aside, right? Okay. So we can clearly see like the colors stand out as to what these things are and you can see them, right? Now, I personally, just for designing something, the main content should be everything that you see on the page, right? I'm sorry. The main content should be the middle portion of the page. Just as a design perspective. This is a perfect design. Like, you could design it like this. I personally would have structured it more where main is main, right? But main contains a section and main contains the aside. That's personally how I would have structured this. Okay. I'm going to put main in here and then give main these two other elements. And so I'm just going to remove the naming convention for main so it doesn't take up any space. And we see that the elements appear the same way that they might have before. You just don't see main. Does this make sense the way I would have written this? Like, are there any kind of like arguments against not doing it like that? Do you feel like strongly that that's just not a correct way of doing it?
Well, would it be harder to manipulate the section and aside since technically they're not they're grandchildren, I guess?
Correct. You're absolutely right. They are grandchildren. Now, let's just say that you weren't using grid at this point in time. Would this also have been just a normal way that you would have written it? Just take out the fact that what you just learned with this new tool allows you to put anything anywhere. Does this still not make sense that you don't have access to that new tool? How would you have designed this knowing you couldn't use grid? It's hard, right? It's not as easy.
I would have just made a div and then just put two things in that div.
Correct. And that's what main is doing though, right?
Yeah.
Main is, remember, I'm trying to use, I'm implementing here semantic elements to convey the context of the content, right? Main on the page should be like the huge chunk of the page that contains the main content, and header and footer are just kind of always there, right? Header's your links to move around the page. Footer's just additional reference information. There's obviously some sort of navigation in the footer also that allows you to get through. And then everything in the middle, boom, that's main, right? And so if that's main, then it should contain the main content and any asides or any articles or anything else, to me, should be inside of main. That's just how I visually see it. Like, I've been doing this particular layout probably for years now, teaching it, and I always kind of default to this. What happens is when students learn grid and they reapproach this, they immediately do what was just suggested, and they put everything into this tall hierarchy where it's just like, hey, I'm going to put everything on top of each other, and then I'm going to use grid to like move it around, right? Grid, I don't necessarily think is meant to do that, to be like, just write it all out, and then you move it around wherever you want. you should still sectionalize the content. Things that should be nested inside other things should be nested inside other things, right? And so I would say this is more of a design perspective. Now, being that if this was the design and main contained section and main contained aside, how would you achieve this inner design? How would main reflect that data? Any ideas?
Would you have to set main as its own CSS grid?
Yeah. So you can use nested grids. I mean, you must have done that with Flexbox, right? Flexbox had the same thing. Flexbox only affected its direct children, not its grandchildren. Now, here's my thought process also. Inside of main, I have what might be considered content. I don't know. It's kind of one of those things. What's content? What's not content? What's layout? What's not layout, right? The fact that that article clearly said at the very bottom, right? It clearly said that they should be used together, not as an alternative for one another. Could Flexbox be used to implement that design? Where is it again? Could you use Flexbox in here? And how would you
say so?
Yeah. All right. How would you do that? How would you use Flexbox on the main container?
Display flex box.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sweet. And so the elements would sit next to each other?
Side by side.
Okay. Would they sit in this proportion?
Yes, they would.
I like it. You're like, I'm just going to tell him yes. And then he's going to tell me no. All right. If we did do that, and here is layout 1 for the column, just to kind of show you perspective. I'm going to let you go off and do this and see how you come back with it. But let's just say I did. And each one of these, they're all inside their own little layouts. Here's layout 2. So there's a class of layout 2. There's a class of layout 1. So the fact that I want to target things specifically in layout 1, I want to use that target, right? Because everything is going to have a header and a footer. And if you just start doing header and footers, you're going to target every header and footer within every column layout. So let's just say I want to target that. Maybe I want to target the container, right? And I want to target main, right? And main is the semantic element. If I did do display flex here, does that meet your expectations, Rod? No, right? They don't. They sit next to each other, but they don't take up those proportions. I'd like you to use flex within this main, but I want you to figure out how to use flex to get it to work. Now, I know you've worked with flex. We didn't cover flex. This was just a introduce you to grid thing, but I want to see if you can use both grid and flex, okay? So, it's 12:09. Why don't we take a 10-minute break? When we come back, we'll kind of jump into the lab, and I'll give you time to do this and answer any questions that you might have, okay? Let me stop sharing. I will, and yes. Take what you've learned with grid so far. Once again, you have the design that we were working on, right? And take that design and see if you can apply this to this particular layout, which is a pretty basic layout, but also the 2, the 3, and the simple column layout, okay? I'm gonna stop sharing, okay? I'm gonna say probably about 20 minutes. Start working on it. I'll check in about 20 minutes to see if you've completed or where people stand on the 2-column layout. Okay, but if you do get it done, I'm just going to put here, click on thumbs up if thumbs up when you, here we go. I'm just going to do this. I'll do another poll. Done with layout. There we go. 2 column 3 column. I think the third one is what, like a marketing one? What is it? Simple marketing. Okay. Got it. All right, just put a poll in there. So when you're done with any one of those layouts, you can just click, I'm done with the 2 column, done with the 3. I'm going to check in and say like 15, 20 minutes just to see where everyone's at. If no one's done with the 2 column, then we'll walk through a 2 column solution. Even if you are, we'll just kind of walk through it. I don't want anyone to truly get too stuck. I'll set the timer here for about 20 minutes. If you have any questions, just reach out to me directly. I think what I'll do is do breakout rooms. Yeah, I'll do breakout rooms also. Let me do that. Put everyone in their own breakout room. And then Brendan Khalib can also jump in. I can jump in. So manually do the breakout rooms. Okay. Khalib and right? Charles, Ace, Paul, Rod, Travis, Shira, Chrissy, Dustin, Quincy, and Ryan. Oh, okay. Here we go. Open all rooms.